No one in Black River had ever seen a storm quite like the one that rolled through Walter Briggs's ranch that spring. And they weren't just talking about the weather. Out behind the old barn, tethered to a heavy fence post, the new horse was already famous, though not in any way his owner might have hoped. He was big for a Mustang, coal black, with a single streak of white running down his nose like a scar left by lightning. His name, fittingly, was Storm. By noon, the gossip had settled thick as dust. Young riders gathered in loose knots near the corral, their boots caked with mud, eyes sharp with anticipation. No one even pretended to be working. They just watched, waiting for the next disaster. Because since Storm's arrival, disaster was a daily guest. Walter Briggs himself, broad-shouldered and red-faced, stalked out of his office, slamming the door hard enough to make his secretary flinch. He glared at the young men clustered by the fence, then at the horse thrashing and snorting in the ring. Anyone with a lick of sense wouldn't go near that beast, he grumbled, but his voice was tinged with a grudging respect. Storm had broken 2 fences and sent 1 cocky jockey to the ER already. Nobody blamed the kid for quitting. Grace Mitchell watched the scene from a distance, arms crossed, her face unreadable. At 48, with sun-browned skin and hair more silver than blonde these days, Grace didn't care much for drama. She'd spent most of her life at the edges of places like this, training horses no one else wanted, preferring the company of animals and the hush of early morning over gossip and noise. Most folks in Black River knew her name, but few claimed to know her well. That was just how she liked it. Today, though, the peace she treasured was nowhere to be found. A sharp, mocking laugh drew her attention. It was Jake, the ranch's best young rider, cocky and cruel as a coyote. "Hey, Grace," he called, waving her over. "Why don't you show us how it's done? I hear you're some kind of horse whisperer, right?" The others snickered. Even Briggs managed a thin, expectant smile. Grace felt the weight of their eyes, the challenge simmering in the air. She didn't flinch. Instead, she walked right up to the fence, boots scraping on the dirt. Jake grinned, smelling blood. "I'll make you a deal," he said, loud enough for the whole ranch to hear. "You tame Storm, you get the respect of every rider on this ranch. We'll even chip in for a bottle of whiskey. But if you fail, well, you gotta clean out the stables for a month. Deal?" Grace's lips quirked. "Make it 2 months," she said. "And if I win, you boys help me mend the north fence. It's falling apart." A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd. Jake glanced at the others, then nodded, spitting into the dust. "You're on." Briggs stepped forward, his hands on his hips. "You sure about this, Grace? That horse has got a demon in him." Grace met his eyes calmly. "He's just scared. Most wild things are when you corner 'em." Someone in the back snorted. "You're gonna get yourself killed." But Grace didn't answer. She pushed open the gate and stepped inside the corral, the murmurs of the crowd fading behind her. The air inside the ring was different, tense, alive, the smell of sweat and fear so sharp it was almost metallic. Storm reared, hooves slicing the air, eyes rolling wild and white. For a moment, he looked like he might leap the fence itself. The young riders shifted nervously. Grace just stood there, hands at her sides, her boots planted in the dirt. She waited, saying nothing. Jake leaned on the fence rail, trying to sound bored. What's she doing? Praying? But there was something in Grace's stillness that unsettled even the cockiest boys. The ranch fell quiet, the only sound the heavy rush of Storm's breathing. Grace didn't reach for a rope or a whip. She didn't move at all, just watched the horse with calm, steady eyes. Minutes dragged by. Storm circled her, tossing his head, snorting clouds of dust. At one point, he charged the fence, making the crowd scatter, then spun back, nostrils flared. Grace stayed rooted, the center of the storm. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke, but it carried clear across the corral. "It's all right. No one's going to hurt you." Storm jerked, as if confused by her calm. The horse pawed at the ground. Angry, uncertain. Grace took a single step forward, slow and deliberate. The ranch hands tensed, bracing for impact. Storm surged forward, barreling straight at her. Someone screamed, the sort of raw, helpless sound that happens when a person's sure they're about to see something terrible. But just as Storm reached her, just as everyone expected to see Grace trampled or tossed like a rag doll, the horse skidded to a halt, dust swirling around them. For one long, electric moment, woman and horse stared at each other, neither moving, both breathing hard. The entire ranch held its breath. Jake swore under his breath. Briggs's jaw dropped. Grace just smiled, a small, tired smile, the kind that comes from years of patient waiting. "See?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's all right." The spell broke. Storm wheeled away, snorting, but didn't attack. Grace let out a breath and turned back to the fence. The crowd was stunned into silence, unsure if what they'd seen was bravery or madness. That night, as the sun set over Black River, everyone at the ranch had a new story to tell. But Grace Mitchell wasn't thinking about glory or bets or the whispers that would fill the bunkhouse. She was thinking about Storm and the long, hard days ahead. She had made her bet with the devil, and tomorrow, the real work would begin. The next morning, dawn crept slowly across Black River Ranch, coloring the mist over the fields in soft gold. Grace arrived before anyone else, as she always did, her old truck bouncing along the rutted drive. She parked near the barn, slid out, and listened to the quiet. Only the lowing of distant cattle and the nervous rustle of horses in their stalls. The corral felt even larger in the early light, its wooden rails still damp from the morning dew. But Storm was already awake. He paced the enclosure, eyes wild, black mane matted from a sleepless night. He charged the fence every so often, kicking up dirt, his tail whipping in frustration. Grace watched him for a while from outside the ring, just letting the silence settle between them. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she was working with a skittish child. That's what most people missed. Wildness was often just fear wearing a mask. The ranch began to stir. One by one, the young riders drifted in, their laughter and bravado echoing across the open space. Jake was there first, his boots thumping on the rails, a wicked grin already plastered on his face. He nudged the others and pointed at Grace, making a show of rolling his eyes. "Hope you said goodbye to your kneecaps, Mitchell." A few of the boys picked up loose clods of dirt and lobbed them over the fence, just to watch Storm spook and rear. The horse snapped at the air, slamming his hooves so hard against the gate that one of the hinges popped loose. The crowd cackled. Jake called out, "Show us what you got, Grace! Or are you going to run for the hills?" Grace ignored them. She slipped inside the corral, shutting the gate behind her with a quiet click. All noise from the crowd vanished, replaced by a thick, pulsing tension. Storm snorted, ears flattened, eyes fixed on her with burning suspicion. Most trainers would have brought a whip, a rope, maybe even a bucket of grain, but Grace carried nothing. She walked into the center of the ring, boots pressing steady circles in the dust, and just stopped. The horse tossed his head, foam flecking his lips, chest heaving with effort. He danced sideways, testing her. The riders grew restless. Jake shouted, "Poke him! Show him who's boss!" Grace closed her eyes for a moment, tuning out the noise, remembering the words her mentor once told her. "You don't break a horse. You break its trust." Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady. Storm suddenly lunged forward, hooves striking the earth so close that dirt sprayed against her jeans. She held her ground. A tense silence gripped the ranch. One step, 2 steps closer. Storm was now nearly within arm's reach, nostrils flared, every muscle coiled for violence. The crowd held its breath. Then, Jake and a couple of other boys, eager to prove a point, rattled the rails and whistled, deliberately trying to set Storm off. The horse spun, furious, his rear legs kicking out with enough force to shatter bone. But Grace didn't move, didn't even blink. Instead, she crouched down, lowering herself to his level, and whispered something no one else could hear. The noise faded. Storm paused mid-charge, confusion flickering in his eyes. He tossed his head, unsure. For a moment, it looked as if he might trample her after all. Time seemed to stretch and bend, every eye glued to the drama playing out in the dust. But then something shifted. Storm inched forward, his breathing loud, hot clouds steaming in the cool air. Grace met his gaze, unflinching, her eyes calm as still water. "Easy, boy," she murmured. "I'm not here to fight you." He stamped once, testing her. Grace stretched out a hand, palm open, empty. The entire ranch seemed to tighten in anticipation. Storm reared suddenly, his massive hooves slicing the air mere inches from Grace's head. The young riders shouted warnings, some scrambling back from the rails. But Grace remained a statue, her steady breath fogging in the chilly morning. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she kept her hand outstretched. Something electric passed between them, a silent challenge, a fragile truce. Storm's chest heaved. His eyes darted from her face to her hand and back again, searching for a threat. But all he saw was patience, not fear. The standoff lasted what felt like forever. Even Walter Briggs, standing near the barn door, held his breath, knuckles white against the railing. At last, Storm's ears flicked forward, his body relaxing by the tiniest fraction. He stomped once more, then, against every expectation, took a step back, lowering his head just a little. He wasn't tamed, not by a long shot, but in that brief pause, the entire balance of power shifted. He had seen her. He had recognized that she wasn't another enemy. Grace let her arm fall and stood, exhaling slowly. The tension snapped, and the crowd erupted into noisy disbelief. Some cheered, some jeered, and Jake shook his head in frustration, unwilling to admit he was impressed. Grace ignored them all. She left the corral, brushing past the gate, her heart thundering as she shut it behind her. She walked over to Briggs, who was now shaking his head in amazement. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mitchell," he said, his tone softer now. Grace shrugged, her voice low but firm. "Sometimes, you have to let the storm come to you. Forcing it only brings more chaos." As she walked away, the ranch buzzed with speculation and wild new rumors. Grace's legend grew in the telling, but she paid it no mind. She knew this was just the beginning. Taming a wild horse took more than courage. It took respect, patience, and a willingness to look beyond fear. Back in the barn, Storm paced restlessly, but every so often he'd glance toward the door, ears pricked, as if listening for the quiet woman who'd faced his fury and hadn't flinched. And for the first time, hope crept into the hearts of those watching from the shadows. Maybe, just maybe, this impossible horse had finally met his match. Mornings on Black River Ranch always started with a quiet kind of hope. Sunlight spilled over the paddocks, burning off the mist that hovered just above the ground, and dew clung to the wild grasses like 1,000 tiny promises. It was in these hours, before the heat and the noise took over, that Grace found her best moments with the horses, and lately with Storm. Unlike the other trainers who came armed with halters and lunge whips, Grace carried nothing but an old folding chair and a paperback novel. Day after day, she set up outside Storm's stall, a respectful distance away, and settled in with her book. Sometimes she read aloud, her low voice blending with the soft rustling of hay and the faint clatter of the ranch coming to life. Sometimes she just sat, silent and watchful, letting Storm get used to the sound of her breathing. The other ranch hands didn't get it. Jake was the loudest skeptic, always lurking near the barn, tossing off snide remarks to anyone who'd listen. "Maybe she's waiting for the horse to get bored and walk over," he joked one morning, earning a round of laughter. But Grace didn't even look up. She knew real change wasn't loud. It happened quietly, bit by bit, like rain soaking into thirsty earth. A few days passed like this. Storm was still unpredictable, ears pinned back and eyes wary. But the frantic energy that had defined his first days on the ranch began to fade. He'd pace the stall at first, huffing and tossing his head, but eventually curiosity would win out. One morning, as Grace was halfway through a chapter, she felt a warm gust on her hand. Storm had stretched his long neck over the stall door, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the pages. Grace smiled, turning the book toward him as if sharing a secret. By the end of that week, Storm would come closer when Grace arrived. He'd watch her with one skeptical eye as she spoke softly, sometimes about nothing at all. The weather, her old dog back home, a funny story from her childhood. Grace knew horses didn't understand words, but they recognized intention, and there was comfort in her steady, unhurried tone. It was on one of these golden mornings that Lily, the ranch manager's daughter, wandered over to where Grace sat. Lily was just 8 years old, with wild red curls and a stubborn streak that matched Storm's. She watched for a while, then plopped down next to Grace, legs crossed, her gaze flicking between the woman and the horse. "How come you don't just make him do what you want?" Lily asked, her voice soft but insistent. "That's what Daddy does with the other horses." Grace looked at the girl, then at Storm, who was watching them both. "Sometimes, making something happen fast isn't the same as making it right," Grace replied. "With horses and with people, too. You gotta give them a reason to trust you first. Otherwise, all you're teaching is fear." Lily frowned, thinking hard. "But what if he never trusts you?" Grace smiled. "Then I just keep showing up. You'd be surprised what patience can do if you give it enough time." Just then, Storm edged closer, stretching his neck even farther over the door. Lily grinned, reaching out her hand. Storm drew back, unsure, but didn't bolt. Grace nodded approvingly. "See? That's progress. It doesn't have to be a big thing. Sometimes it's just a horse sniffing your hand instead of biting it." Later that afternoon, as the ranch buzzed with chores and chatter, Jake wandered by and spotted Grace still at her post. He sneered, waving a carrot stick in the air. "Maybe you'd get somewhere if you actually did some training?" he jeered. Or is this just nap time for you two? Grace glanced at him, unbothered. Everyone's got their own way. Jake. He scoffed and stormed off, but not before the barn manager, Mrs. Alden, wandered over. She was a tall, stern woman with a kind face, and she leaned on the stall door with interest. You've got the patience of a saint, Grace. Most folks would have given up by now. Grace shook her head, her voice even. I've seen what happens when you rush a frightened horse. All you get is another wreck, or worse. Besides, he's not just a horse. He's a story nobody bothered to read yet. Storm seemed to respond to the calm, to the rhythm of Grace's days. The first time he let her touch his nose, it was like holding a heartbeat in her hand. She didn't reach for him. She let him come to her. When his muzzle finally pressed against her palm, Grace felt a tiny shift, like the cracking open of a door that had been locked a long, long time. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the barnyard, Grace sat with her feet up on the bottom rail, watching Storm graze. Lily ran up, out of breath, clutching a wildflower bouquet. Miss Grace, she called. Storm let me feed him a handful of hay, just for a second. Grace smiled, her heart lifting at the sight. That's because you were patient, Lily. That's all it takes. Word began to spread across the ranch. The angry, impossible horse wasn't so impossible after all. The others still doubted, still whispered and joked. But there was a shift in the way people looked at Grace and at Storm. Something was changing, slow, steady, and real. On her way out that night, Grace paused at Storm's stall, watching him as he lifted his head to meet her gaze. We're getting there, aren't we, boy? She whispered. And for the first time, Storm didn't look away. Outside, the stars blinked awake over Black River, and Grace walked back to her truck with the quiet satisfaction that only comes from doing the right thing, even when no one else believes in you yet. The fight was far from over, but for Grace Mitchell, hope was a patient thing, and she had all the time in the world. The rhythm of ranch life carried on, but something unspoken lingered in the air around Black River. The horse everyone called a lost cause was changing, just a little, but enough for even the skeptics to notice. Grace's gentle persistence with Storm was working, but for her it was more than just another job. Every morning she stood at the corral, feeling the crisp wind and the warming sun. Her thoughts drifted back through the years, to battles fought in silence and lessons written in scars. It was a cold memory that arrived unbidden one afternoon as she watched Storm graze, his movements finally calm enough to seem almost peaceful. She saw herself at 20, young and stubborn, the only woman at a rundown stable outside Amarillo. Back then, her hair was a shining gold, her spirit as wild as any horse in the yard. The men who ran the place had little patience for a girl with soft hands and city boots. They laughed when she said she wanted to train, said the work was too rough, the horses too mean. Grace remembered the sting of their laughter, the way it hardened her, drove her to show them she wasn't just passing through. In those days, respect had to be earned the hard way. She took the worst chores, mucking out stalls long after the others had gone home. She listened more than she spoke, learning the moods of every animal, every flick of an ear and swish of a tail. There was one horse, Midnight, a battered old gelding, half blind and mean from years of rough handling. Most folks steered clear, but Grace saw something in his wary eyes. She spent weeks just sitting outside his pen, tossing him apples, humming old country songs. Little by little, Midnight's anger faded, replaced by a weary sort of trust. One winter evening, a bitter wind rattled the barn. The boss's son, drunk and angry, thought it'd be funny to startle Midnight. He banged on the gate, shouting and waving a rope, spooking the horse into a wild frenzy. Grace saw the flash of panic in Midnight's eyes as he charged the fence, right where she stood, trapped by the snowdrift at her feet. There was no time to run. The big horse veered at the last second, crashing into the gate and sending Grace sprawling, but stopping short of trampling her. Midnight's muzzle hovered over her, nostrils flaring, as if making sure she was safe. It was the first time anyone at that stable had seen gentleness in that old horse. The memory never left Grace. That night changed her, not just because Midnight had saved her, but because she realized what true respect looked like. It wasn't fear or brute force. It was trust, earned day by day, and the willingness to see past anger to the wounded spirit beneath. Now, decades later, facing Storm, Grace carried that lesson like a secret. She could sense the woundedness behind his rage, the memory of old hurts and broken promises. Every horse, she believed, was the sum of all their days, the good, the bad, the fearful, and the free. The present intruded with the sound of Lily's laughter, running through the barn with a pack of puppies chasing her heels. Grace smiled, her reverie broken, and called the girl over. "Got a minute, cowgirl?" Lily plopped down beside her, cheeks red from running. "What's up?" Grace considered how much to share. "You know, a long time ago I was scared of horses." Lily's eyes went wide. "No way! You're never scared of anything." Grace chuckled. "I was, though. I got knocked down, laughed at, told I couldn't do this job because I was a girl. It made me want to prove them wrong, but it also taught me something. The best way to lead is to listen. Not just to people, but to horses, too." Lily thought about that. "So that's why you're so nice to Storm." "Exactly," Grace said, brushing a lock of hair from Lily's face. "You can't force trust. You have to earn it, little by little." Later that afternoon, while the other ranch hands wrangled a stubborn steer in the north pasture, Grace spent time in the quiet with Storm. She brought her folding chair, a fresh apple, and nothing else. She remembered the way Midnight had accepted her all those years ago, how every small act of patience had added up to a moment of grace. Storm eyed her warily, but the wild fury was fading. Grace sat just outside the reach of his hooves, humming quietly, slicing the apple into small pieces. She tossed one his way and waited. He sniffed it, lipped it, then looked at her, curiosity softening the edge of his gaze. Grace offered another slice, and this time Storm stepped closer, his breath tickling her palm. It was a tiny victory, almost invisible. But to Grace it felt like the opening of a door. As the sun set, painting the paddocks in gold and amber, Grace reflected on how far they had come, and how much lay ahead. She knew the others still doubted, still whispered that her methods were too slow, too gentle. But she also knew the truth of it. Real change was slow. Real respect was earned, not demanded. In her small room at the ranch house that night, Grace sat by the window, looking out at the dark shapes of horses grazing. She thought of every young woman fighting to prove herself in a world that didn't want her, every frightened animal waiting for someone to listen, every stubborn soul who needed a little more time. She thought of Midnight and Storm and Lily and all the bridges she'd built, quietly, patiently, day after day. Some scars never faded, she knew, but sometimes, with enough patience and respect, Even the wildest hearts could find peace. And in that, Grace Mitchell found her strength, not just as a trainer, but as a woman who believed, above all, in the quiet power of understanding. The gentle pace of early spring changed suddenly at Black River Ranch. For all the slow patience and quiet victories, there remained a current of resentment that ran just below the surface, growing sharper as the days passed. Some of the younger riders, especially those with something to prove, watched Grace's progress with Storm with increasing envy. Her calm persistence challenged everything they thought they knew about horses and about themselves. It was just past midnight when the trouble began. The bunkhouse was dark, except for the flicker of a single lamp at the end, where Jake and two others sat hunched over a battered deck of cards. Their voices were low and tense. "She's making us look bad," Jake muttered, tossing down his hand. "Every day she gets that devil horse to come closer. Folks act like she walks on water." "Maybe we ought to remind them who runs this place," one of the others said, his words thick with bitterness. They looked at each other, and something reckless passed between them. Before the moon had climbed high, the boys were out by the barn, boots crunching on gravel, their shadows long and mean. They crept to Storm's paddock, careful to avoid the security lights. Jake nodded, and they began rattling the gate, hissing and shouting, throwing pebbles at the sleeping horse to spook him. Storm woke with a start, eyes rolling, his whole body tense with panic. Inside the ranch house, Grace was awake, reading by lamplight. She heard the distant commotion, the sharp clang of metal, a panicked whinny, muffled laughter, and something inside her snapped to attention. She grabbed her boots and hurried outside, the cold biting through her sweater as she ran toward the chaos. By the time she reached the paddock, Storm was thrashing, rearing up and slamming against the fence with all his might. The boys, emboldened by the darkness, kept up their racket, not realizing how far things had gone. Grace shouted, "Stop! You'll get him hurt! Or yourselves!" The boys scattered at the sound of her voice, but not before Jake hurled one last rock at the fence. The noise sent Storm into a final wild frenzy. He kicked out, his hooves striking the wooden rail, which cracked with a sickening snap. Splinters flew. Grace jumped back just in time, but her arm caught the edge of the splintered wood, tearing her sleeve and grazing her skin. She gasped, the pain sharp and bright. Storm, sensing her distress, reared again, desperate to escape the confusion. Grace forced herself to stand her ground, voice trembling but firm. "Easy, Storm. I'm here. I'm not leaving you." Storm circled, breath coming in ragged bursts. Grace, fighting the throb in her arm, began to hum. A slow, steady tune she remembered from childhood, the one that had soothed midnight all those years ago. The melody floated across the paddock, cutting through the noise and fear. Slowly, Storm's wild energy began to ebb. He pawed the ground, then pressed his head against the gate, searching for the calm he always found in Grace's presence. By the time the rest of the ranch stirred, Walter Briggs himself among them, barking orders and demanding answers. The saboteurs were long gone, melted into the shadows. Only Grace and Storm remained in the pale light of dawn, battered but still standing. Briggs approached, his face a mask of worry and frustration. What the hell happened here? Grace met his gaze, refusing to show the pain in her arm. Some boys thought they'd teach Storm a lesson. All they did was scare him half to death. Briggs glanced at the shattered rail, then at Grace's bloodied sleeve. "You should get that looked at." Grace shook her head. "Later." Storm needs me now. The ranch hands gathered in uneasy silence as Grace, moving slowly, entered the paddock. Storm's body trembled, sweat darkening his coat. Grace approached with infinite patience, her movements careful and predictable. She reached out, letting him sniff her hand, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's over now. You're safe." To everyone's astonishment, Storm let her touch his nose, then his cheek. He didn't flinch or pull away. Grace pressed her palm against his warm skin, feeling the thundering heartbeat beneath. The ranch hands stared, unable to believe what they were seeing. Jake and the others watched from a distance, shame flickering across their faces. For a moment, Jake looked like he might step forward and confess, but pride kept him rooted in place. He turned away, jaw clenched, as if the truth was too heavy to carry. The rest of the day moved slowly. Grace's injury, though not serious, was a stark reminder of how quickly trust could be undone. Still, she refused to let anger take root. She spoke softly to Storm as she cleaned the wound on her arm, telling him stories, letting him see that even pain could be endured without fear or fury. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Grace found Storm waiting by the fence. He nickered softly when he saw her, a sound full of trust and hope. She smiled, tears stinging her eyes, and reached out to stroke his neck. "You did good, boy. You did real good." Word spread quickly through the ranch. The untamable horse, once wild and dangerous, now allowed Grace to touch him freely. For the first time, she led him from the paddock into the open field, the two of them moving as one beneath the golden sky. That night, as the bunkhouse fell silent and the stars glimmered overhead, Grace sat with Storm under the old oak tree. She spoke to him not as a trainer, but as a friend, two wounded souls learning to trust again. In the hush of the dark, a new bond was forged, stronger than any challenge thrown their way. The storm of jealousy and sabotage had passed. What remained was something no one could steal or break, a fragile, stubborn trust, born of patience, suffering, and quiet courage. And for the first time, the whole ranch began to wonder, maybe, just maybe, this was more than a lucky break. Maybe it was the beginning of a miracle. The events of that long, bruising night clung to the ranch like a heavy fog. Storm was jumpy, still flinching at sudden noises, but something fundamental had shifted between him and Grace. The other riders kept their distance, guilt and awe mixing in their sideways glances. The air felt thick with expectation, as if everyone sensed the story was barreling toward some unseen brink. Grace's injury forced her to slow down for a few days. She wrapped her arm in gauze, brushed off offers of help, and spent most of her hours with Storm, just being there, making sure he didn't lose the thin thread of trust they'd woven together. She'd never been one to let pain stop her, but she'd also learned the hard way that healing, like horse training, could not be rushed. On the third morning after the sabotage, Briggs called her into his office. The room was lined with old photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings about Black River's glory days, and a battered hat hanging from a nail. Briggs stood behind his desk, arms folded. "You know, Mitchell, you've already done more than I thought possible. The men, well, they're talking. Even Jake's different. You sure you want to keep pushing this?" Grace met his gaze, tired but determined. "Storm's not done. I'm not either." Briggs nodded, a grudging respect in his eyes. "Just be careful." Outside, the sky was clear and sharp, the kind of blue that made the world feel endless. Grace walked to Storm's paddock with a new resolve. She leaned against the fence, watching the Mustang pace, tense, alert, but waiting for her. She opened the gate and stepped inside, moving slow, her body language open and unthreatening. Storm's ears flicked forward, curiosity edging out his old suspicion. Today was different. Grace felt it deep in her bones. She knelt in the dirt, hands at her sides, and waited. Storm circled her, snorting, muscles taut. The ranch hands gathered, whispering. Even Briggs stood outside his office, silent as a statue. After what felt like forever, Storm came to a halt, just out of arm's reach. Grace looked up at him, the wind teasing stray strands of silver from her braid. "It's time, isn't it?" she said softly, almost to herself. With a deliberate motion, she reached for Storm's halter, unfastened it, and let it fall away. She stepped back, giving him the whole space, the whole world, to choose what came next. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. No one let wild horses loose in an open paddock, not after what happened on Storm's first day. But Grace stood her ground, heart pounding, every muscle alive with hope and dread. Storm jerked his head, blinking as if stunned by sudden freedom. He looked at the open field beyond, at the humans clustered on the other side of the fence, at Grace standing quietly in the center. For a moment, it seemed he might bolt, disappearing into the rolling grasslands forever. Jake muttered, "She's lost her mind. He'll never come back." The others nodded, betting on chaos. Grace heard them, but kept her focus on Storm, her posture an invitation, not a command. She knelt again, dropping her gaze to show she wasn't a threat. "It's your choice, Storm. Run if you have to." Storm took a few tentative steps toward the fence, stopped, and threw his head, muscles quivering with indecision. The crowd held its breath. Then, impossibly, he turned, one ear cocked to Grace's voice, one eye never leaving her. She began to hum, that same slow tune, the one that had calmed midnight, the one that now belonged to Storm. Her voice was soft but unwavering, floating across the paddock like a promise. The silence stretched so thin it almost hurt. Then Storm pivoted, trotted back toward Grace, and stopped right in front of her, his nose brushing her shoulder. It was a surrender, but not the kind that meant defeat. It was trust, raw and new, balanced on a knife's edge. The ranch erupted, shouts, laughter, stunned applause. Briggs stared, slack-jawed, while Jake slumped against the fence, all his earlier arrogance gone. Even the youngest hands who doubted Grace now watched in awed silence. Storm stood with Grace in the center of the field, his side pressed to her arm as if to say, "I choose this." She stroked his neck, tears blurring her vision. "You're free, and you chose me. That's all I ever wanted." As the excitement faded, Briggs approached, removing his hat in a rare gesture of respect. "I don't know what to say, Mitchell. I've never seen anything like that." Grace smiled through her tears. "It's not about control. It's about letting go." Jake and the others shuffled over, embarrassment mixing with newfound respect. Jake kicked at the dirt, then looked up. "Sorry, Grace, for everything. I didn't get it until now." Grace nodded. "It's not too late to learn, for any of us." The rest of the day, Storm followed her everywhere. No rope, no halter, just the quiet connection they'd built. Children from the ranch crept closer, wide-eyed, and even Lily managed to stroke Storm's shoulder, her face glowing with pride. That evening, as dusk gathered and the sky turned to violet, Grace sat in the field with Storm's head resting in her lap. The others watched from a distance, moved but unsure how to step into this new world where patience and trust had won out. For the first time since arriving at Black River, Storm lay down beside Grace, letting his guard fall completely. The ranch, usually so full of noise and rivalry, seemed hushed and gentle in the fading light. Grace stroked the horse's mane, thinking of every setback and every step forward, grateful for every stubborn day that had led to this. She looked at the horizon, hope blooming quietly in her chest. Whatever happened next, she and Storm would face it together, not as trainer and beast, but as equals. In the space between freedom and fear, they'd found something better, a trust strong enough to change them both. And all across Black River, people began to believe that some storms really could be tamed, not with force, but with the courage to let go. The morning after Storm's breakthrough, Black River Ranch awoke to a restless anticipation. Word had spread through the town like wildfire. Grace Mitchell was going to try riding the untamable Mustang. The ranch hands, normally scattered across the property by sunrise, gathered early along the fence rails, coffee mugs clutched tight, voices hushed and uncertain. Even Walter Briggs arrived before dawn, a rare occurrence that spoke to the magnitude of the moment. The air was brisk, touched with the promise of spring, and the sky glowed with that deep blue only seen just after sunrise. Grace took her time with the morning routine, feeding the other horses and helping Lily with the barn cats before she approached Storm's paddock. She sensed the weight of every eye on her back, but she moved with the same calm and deliberate rhythm she'd always shown. Storm was waiting by the fence, ears perked, his coat glinting in the slanted light. Grace greeted him softly, brushing his neck with slow strokes, murmuring nonsense words just for him. She checked his hooves, ran her hands down each leg, all the while humming that old lullaby. Around her, the audience grew. Ranchers, townsfolk, even a reporter from the local paper, all pressed against the rails with barely concealed nerves. Briggs approached, brow furrowed with concern. "You sure you want to do this, Grace? There's no shame in waiting." Grace offered him a wry smile. "He's ready. So am I." Then, lowering her voice so only Briggs could hear, "You can't keep a storm locked up forever. Sometimes, you just have to trust the weather." She led Storm into the main arena, letting the Mustang move at his own pace. Every step he took seemed to echo the journey they'd traveled together. Each small victory, each setback, each moment of doubt and hope. Grace paused in the center of the ring, slipping off Storm's halter so that nothing bound him but his own willingness. She took a deep breath, pressing a hand to her chest to steady the flutter inside. Storm stood still, muscles rippling with nervous energy. For a heartbeat, the world felt utterly silent. No wind, no birdsong, not even the creak of boots on wood. Only the two of them facing the next impossible step. Grace moved slowly, talking to Storm as she set her foot in the stirrup, reminding him of the bond they'd built. "It's just you and me, boy. If you're not ready, we don't have to do this. But if you are, I'll be right here. I promise." Storm's ears flicked back, then forward. He shifted, uncertain. But he didn't bolt. He turned his great head and sniffed Grace's sleeve as if to say, "I remember you. I trust you." Grace swung her leg over and settled gently into the saddle. At first, Storm tensed, quivering beneath her like a coiled spring. The watching crowd barely dared to breathe. Grace sat loose, letting her weight settle, hands light on the reins, giving Storm time to feel her presence. She kept her voice soft, her touch softer. "That's it, Storm. It's just another step. For a long, electric moment, Storm stood frozen. Jake muttered, "He's gonna buck her clear into the next county." But then, with a shudder that rippled through his whole frame, Storm took a tentative step forward. Then another. The crowd exhaled, the tension easing only a fraction. Storm's stride grew bolder, the panic in his eyes replaced by fierce focus. Grace kept her balance, letting the Mustang choose the pace. She didn't urge him into a trot or try to control him. She just rode with him, matching his movement, their shadows stretching across the sunlit arena. Suddenly, a sharp whistle from the fence startled Storm. For a split second, his head shot up, muscles bunching as if ready to explode. Grace tensed, then caught herself. She whispered, "It's okay. I'm still here." She reached forward and stroked his neck, feeling his pulse race beneath her palm. Storm snorted, took a wild leap to the side, but Grace stayed with him, her center low and steady, absorbing every jolt. The crowd gasped. For a moment it seemed everything might unravel. But then Storm slowed, tossing his head, and looked back at Grace as if searching for guidance. She met his gaze, her calm unwavering, her patience unbroken. Then, with a snort, Storm broke into a gallop, wild and beautiful, surging around the ring with Grace balanced like a dancer on his back. The ranch erupted in shouts and cheers as the two of them became a single fluid motion. Mustang and woman, courage and trust. All the lessons of the past weeks playing out beneath the open sky. As they circled, the sunlight caught them just so. Grace's hair flying, Storm's mane streaming behind. A picture so breathtaking that for a moment, time itself seemed to stop. In that gallop, Storm was neither prisoner nor enemy. He was free, and so was she. They slowed to a walk, Grace guiding Storm toward the fence where Lily waited, eyes wide with awe. Grace slid off, landing lightly, and hugged the little girl. "See, Lily? Patience wins out in the end." Briggs pushed his way through the crowd, jaw slack with amazement. "Grace, I've seen a lot of things in my day, but never this." His eyes were shining. "You've done what no one else could." Jake was the next to approach, head bowed. "You were right, Grace, about all of it. I'd like to learn if you'll let me." Grace smiled, reaching out to squeeze his shoulder. "We all start somewhere, Jake. I'd be glad to show you." That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the arena emptied out, Grace stayed with Storm. She brushed his coat, whispering her thanks. He stood calm and steady, every trace of wildness tempered by the bond they had built. When the last light faded and the ranch fell silent, Grace sat on the fence, watching Storm graze. She felt a deep contentment, more than pride, more than relief. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had listened when others shouted, waited when others rushed, and believed when others gave up. The first ride was over, but Grace knew the journey had only just begun. In the soft hush of twilight, woman and Mustang stood together, stronger and braver for all they had endured, ready at last for whatever the next day might bring. The day after the ride, Black River Ranch felt like a different place. Where skepticism and envy had once lingered, a new sense of pride and possibility now floated on the wind. The air buzzed with conversations about what they'd witnessed. Grace Mitchell, the quiet trainer, had done the impossible without force or spectacle. People who'd scoffed at her ways now stopped to watch her work, curious and humbled. By midday, even Walter Briggs seemed changed. He walked with an unusual spring in his step and spent more time outside the office, watching Storm graze peacefully beside Grace. The Mustang no longer paced the fence or shied from voices. Instead, he wandered the pastures with a calm that radiated to the whole herd. Word of Grace's success had spread quickly. Local families, neighboring ranchers, even a reporter from the county paper arrived to see the woman who'd tamed Black River's wildest horse. The ranch, once divided by doubt, felt united for the first time in years. In the bunkhouse, Jake and the other young riders replayed every detail of the ride. Each buck and leap, every moment Grace stayed steady. The story grew with each telling, but everyone agreed on one thing. Nothing had ever brought the ranch together like this. That afternoon, Briggs called everyone to the arena. The whole crew gathered, stable hands, kitchen staff, Lily and her mother, and a few old-timers who rarely left their porches. Even Storm stood at the rail, his presence as much a part of the ranch now as the wind in the cottonwoods. Briggs cleared his throat, hat in hand. "I won't pretend I understood Grace's ways when she got here," he began. "And I won't pretend I didn't doubt her. Hell, most of us did." A ripple of laughter broke the tension, but Briggs's eyes were serious. But sometimes, it takes a new way of thinking to show us how much we still have to learn. He turned to Grace, his voice wavering just a little. "You did what none of us thought possible. Not just with Storm, but with all of us. You taught us that respect isn't something you take. It's something you earn. And you earned it here. Not just from me, but from everyone on this ranch." With a rare gesture of humility, Briggs bowed his head in front of the entire crew. The ranch hands, stunned, followed suit. Grace stood silent, heart pounding, fighting back tears. She had never wanted attention, never cared about glory. But in that moment, she felt the weight of every battle she'd fought, every slight, every doubt. Every long day spent proving herself, finally fall away. Jake, hat in hand, stepped forward. His voice trembled. "I'm sorry, Grace, for all the things I said, for not believing in you or Storm. You taught me more in a few weeks than I learned in years." The other young riders joined him, nodding. "We want to learn from you, not just how to ride, but how to train with the heart like you do." Grace smiled, her voice thick. "I'd be honored. But you have to promise me something. Never forget how much a little patience can do. It's not just for horses, it's for people too." A cheer broke out, warm and genuine. Briggs extended an invitation. He wanted Grace to stay on as the main advisor to Black River Ranch, to teach not only the staff, but the next generation of riders. "This place needs your spirit, Grace. We all do." Lily ran to Grace, flinging her arms around her waist. "Does this mean you'll stay forever?" she asked, eyes wide and hopeful. Grace laughed, lifting Lily into her arms. "As long as you'll have me, cowgirl." That evening, as dusk turned the fields to gold, Grace stood by the fence and watched the young riders gather for their first lesson. Jake was there, listening intently as she explained her gentle techniques, his pride replaced by curiosity. Storm grazed nearby, his once wild eyes now soft, occasionally lifting his head to nuzzle Grace's shoulder as if blessing the new piece. The ranch felt alive with hope and new beginnings. Even Briggs's attitude changed. He walked the pastures with a lighter step, taking time to thank workers and listen to their ideas. Old grudges faded, replaced by respect for the quiet trainer who had done so much more than tame a horse. She'd given the ranch back its heart. As word spread beyond Black River, letters and calls began to arrive. Local parents wanted Grace to teach their children. not just about horses, but about courage and kindness. She started a free class on Saturdays for kids from all over the county. Under the shade of a big oak tree, she taught them the lessons Storm had taught her: patience, listening, and faith in the unseen. Storm became more than just a horse. He was a symbol of change. Children visited him with apples and carrots. Mothers brought sketchbooks to draw his strong frame and gentle eyes. Storm, once feared and avoided, now basked in the love and admiration of the entire community. As for Grace, she never lost her humility. In quiet moments, she thought about her journey, the hard years, the loneliness, the times she almost gave up. She thought about Midnight, the horse from her youth who first taught her what real trust meant, and she thanked him silently for leading her here. One night, after a long day of teaching and tending to the horses, Grace sat by Storm in the pasture. The stars shone above them. The air was cool and clear. She rested her hand on Storm's neck, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "We did it, boy," she whispered. "But it wasn't just us. It was everyone who believed, even when they were afraid. That's the real victory." Storm nickered softly, pressing closer, and Grace closed her eyes, letting the peace of the night settle around her. Respect had been earned, not through force or pride, but through the simple, stubborn act of believing in what others couldn't see. And at Black River Ranch, that belief had changed everything. Saturday mornings at Black River Ranch were never quiet anymore. Children spilled across the main yard like spilled marbles, laughing, chasing each other, some brave enough to sneak a stroke on Storm's velvety nose. Grace set up folding chairs under the shade of the big oak tree, her notes stacked beside a battered coffee mug, and watched the young faces gather with a satisfaction deeper than any blue ribbon or cash prize. At first, the parents had come just to watch, uncertain what exactly they were signing up for. They stood at the fence, arms folded, faces skeptical. Grace didn't mind. She started each class the same way, by telling the children that they were here to learn about more than horses. "What you practice in the arena," she said, "you'll use out there, in life. Patience, understanding, and believing in yourself. That's what makes a real cowboy or cowgirl. Not just skill." Storm was the perfect teacher. Where once he'd shied from noise and strangers, now he watched the children with a gentle, curious eye. Lily often stood beside him, her small hand buried in his mane, whispering secrets only a horse could understand. Even the rowdiest boys grew quiet in Storm's presence. When one little girl froze in fear, remembering a bad fall, Grace knelt beside her and told her, "It's okay to be scared. We go slow together." They practiced walking with horses, talking to them, learning how to read a flicker of an ear or the swish of a tail. Grace showed them how to move quietly, how to wait until the horse came to them. "It's not about forcing your will," she explained. "It's about building trust." Soon, the lessons turned to broader things. Grace told stories about horses she'd known, mistakes she'd made, times when fear or anger almost got the best of her. She encouraged the children to share too, worries about school, family, the world beyond the ranch. They listened to each other in the shade, sometimes laughing, sometimes silent and thoughtful. Grace noticed even the adults beginning to lean in, learning as much as their kids. As the weeks passed, the transformation spread beyond the Saturday classes. Lily's mother, who once doubted her daughter's stubbornness could ever be a gift, began to see it as strength. Jake, now Grace's most devoted pupil, helped organize after-school rides for the kids, teaching what he'd learned about patience and second chances. Briggs, once gruff and distant, opened his doors to the local 4-H club and visited the elementary school to share the ranch's story. People who'd kept to themselves began coming together to help with repairs, community dinners, and holiday picnics. One hot afternoon, Grace found herself sitting on the fence, watching a dozen children brush Storm's coat in the dappled light. Mrs. Alden, the barn manager, joined her. "You've done something real here, Grace," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "I never thought I'd see this place full of laughter again." Grace smiled, her gaze fixed on Storm. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. Sometimes you need a wild horse to wake a sleepy town." Storm, once a symbol of fear, was now the ranch's living proof that anyone could change. The townsfolk started calling him Hope's Shadow, and his photo hung in the post office beside the veterans and the Little League champs. Kids drew pictures of Storm and wrote essays about him for school. One boy, shy and often bullied, stood up in front of his class and said, "If Storm can trust again, so can I." The ranch changed, but so did Grace. She grew used to the crowds, the questions, even the local news station that came out one Saturday to film her class. She didn't crave attention, but she knew the story wasn't really about her. It was about what patience and belief could build, one careful day at a time. That autumn, Briggs invited the whole town to a harvest festival at Black River Ranch. The kids put on a demonstration, riding, leading, showing how much they'd learned. The parents clapped, neighbors brought pies, and music played long into the evening. Storm, adorned with a garland of wildflowers, let children paint his sides with handprints and hearts. He carried Lily bareback around the pasture, moving slow and steady, as if he'd always belonged. After the crowd had faded and the stars blinked awake, Grace walked alone to Storm's paddock. The air was full of wood smoke and distant laughter. She rested her arms on the rail and watched Storm graze by moonlight, his silhouette strong and peaceful. Jake joined her, quiet for a long time before he spoke. "I used to think being tough meant never backing down. Now I think maybe it means knowing when to listen." Grace nodded, her heart full. "You can lead with fear, or you can lead with understanding. Storm taught us that. Maybe he saved all of us in his own way." Briggs, watching from the porch, caught their eye and waved. "Hey, Grace," he called. "You ever think about writing a book? Folks ought to know what happened here." Grace laughed, shaking her head. "Maybe someday. For now, I'm just happy being here. This," she gestured at the ranch, the fields, the lights twinkling in the dark. "This is enough." As fall deepened and winter approached, the lessons Grace started spread far beyond Black River. Neighboring towns sent their kids, ranchers wrote letters asking for advice. The sheriff stopped by to say that Storm's story had inspired a program for troubled youth. "You gave us all something to hope for, Grace," he said. "We needed that." Every week, Grace ended her class beneath the oak tree the same way. She gathered the children, and sometimes the adults, into a circle and said, "Remember, real strength isn't about forcing your way through. It's about listening, believing, and giving each other the chance to grow. That's what makes us a family, here and everywhere." Storm, standing at her side, seemed to nod in agreement, the living symbol of patience, change, and the power of trust. In Black River, the story of Grace and Storm was no longer just about a woman and a wild horse. It was about everyone who chose to listen, to change, and to build something better together. And as the seasons turned, that lesson echoed out across the plains, as steady and unstoppable as hope itself. The story of Grace Mitchell and Storm spread far beyond Black River. It traveled by word of mouth, in newspaper columns, radio interviews, and viral social media posts, each telling a little different, but all agreeing on one point. Something remarkable had happened at a dusty old ranch in the heart of the American West. What began as a dangerous bet had become a symbol, not just of patience and skill, but of the spirit that defined the very best of America. Journalists drove for hours just to see Storm grazing peacefully beside children, or to catch Grace's early morning classes beneath the ancient oak. Photos appeared online of Storm with his wild mane now soft and shining, of kids in cowboy hats painting his sides, of Grace laughing with the same joy and humility that had carried her through every hardship. Across the country, people were moved. Letters and emails poured in. Parents, teachers, ranchers, city kids who'd never seen a horse before, all wanting to know the secret. How had she done it? Grace always answered the same way. It's not about taming the wild. It's about learning to listen, to trust, and to grow together. One November afternoon, a news crew visited Black River for a feature on Real Americans. Grace was uncomfortable with the spotlight, but she understood this story wasn't just hers anymore. The reporter asked, "What's the real lesson here? Is it about horses or about people?" Grace stood by Storm, one hand resting on his strong neck, the other shading her eyes from the low sun. "It's about both. People and horses aren't so different. We all get scared, all get stubborn, all want to be understood. If you approach anyone with respect and give them space to come to you, you'll be amazed by what's possible. Doesn't matter your age, your gender, or your past. None of that decides your worth." The camera panned over the ranch, kids helping each other with chores, Briggs and the ranch hands working side by side, and Storm at the heart of it all, a living testament to faith and second chances. The local school invited Grace to speak at an assembly. She was nervous at first, but Lily walked with her onto the stage, hand in hand. "You got this, Miss Grace," Lily whispered. Facing hundreds of expectant faces, Grace told her story honestly, about feeling out of place, about being doubted, about almost giving up. But she also spoke about believing in something when no one else did. "Sometimes," she said, "the world tells you you're not enough, but you have to decide for yourself what's possible." The applause that followed was thunderous, not just for Grace, but for every child who'd ever felt unseen. Lily beamed with pride, and afterward, kids lined up to ask questions or just to say thank you. Meanwhile, at Black River Ranch, change was everywhere. Briggs supported new ideas, encouraging the young riders to try Grace's methods. The old rivalries faded. There was a sense that everyone was pulling in the same direction, for the first time in years. Jake organized a patience challenge among the ranch hands. No whips, no shouting, just time and trust. Even the toughest skeptics learned to wait for the right moment, rather than force the wrong one. Storm's legend grew. On weekends, families picnicked under the trees, painting handprints on his coat, taking turns riding him slowly through the fields. Local artists came to sketch him. A songwriter even penned a ballad called Storm's Grace. Grace was invited to share her story at conferences, on podcasts, at agricultural fairs. She always insisted she wasn't special, just stubborn and willing to listen. But in truth, the lesson went deeper. It was Mrs. Alden, the barn manager, who said it best one night by the campfire. Grace, you didn't just teach us how to handle a wild horse. You taught us how to see each other different. This ranch used to run on fear. Now it runs on hope. The deeper message was clear to all who visited Black River. Prejudice, whether about gender, age, or someone's past, meant nothing next to what a person could do when given a real chance. True strength wasn't loud or boastful. It was quiet, patient, and persistent. The ranch became a place where people came to heal as much as horses. Former rivals became friends. The shyest kids found their voices, and even the old-timers started believing that it wasn't too late to change. As the first snow dusted the fields, Grace stood at the paddock gate, watching Lily and the other children race Storm under the pale sky. She was tired, bone-tired, the way you are after a lifetime of giving your all, but her spirit felt light. Storm galloped past, his mane flying, Lily's laughter trailing behind. Grace knew there was nothing left to prove. She had done her work. But as she turned to leave, she heard footsteps and turned to find Briggs, Jake, and a handful of townsfolk waiting for her. Briggs cleared his throat, holding a framed photograph of Grace and Storm in their first ride together. "We just wanted you to know, you changed us. All of us. This ranch, this town. It's different now. Thank you." Jake added, his voice thick. "You made me believe in myself, Grace. You showed us what respect looks like." Lily tugged at Grace's hand, her eyes bright. "Are you happy, Miss Grace?" Grace knelt to meet Lily's gaze. "I am, honey. I really am. Because happiness isn't about winning or being right. It's about helping others find their strength." That evening, as dusk turned the sky to lavender, Grace rode Storm out one last time. The children rode alongside, their laughter and cheers echoing over the hills. At the highest ridge, they all stopped to watch the sun slip beneath the horizon, painting the world gold. In that moment, it was clear. The lesson would last long after Grace and Storm were gone, because in the end, it truly wasn't about taming the wild. It was about listening, about trusting, about growing together. The story of Grace Mitchell and Storm became a new standard, passed from parent to child, rider to rider, generation to generation. And under that endless American sky, a once wild horse and the woman who believed in him had left something behind, a hope that could never be broken, and a promise that if you trust enough to let others in, miracles just might follow.